Hey folks, Seth here. As we watch cities burn, statues being torn down, and calls to defund the police, if you haven't already, it may be time to think about personal protection. Guns Etc. has 10,200 square feet of guns, ammo, safes, and a staff that will work with you to find the best firearm for your situation. So stop by their huge store in Mesa or click on gunsetcetera.com and have access to over $400 million in firearms and accessories. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Welcome back and happy July 29th, 2020. Strange days indeed, to quote the philosopher John Lennon. Since perhaps May, we've of a sudden discovered things that have evidently plagued society negatively and evidently quite foundationally that we didn't even know. John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, for instance, has the club tripping all over itself to do something about the fact that Muir was evidently a racist. I cannot imagine how anyone got through hiking or walking through the Muir Trail in Yosemite or the Muir Grove in Sequoia National Park all these years. Maybe someone will light the General Sherman tree on fire to protest. Of course, the double irony in that would be either too much or too perfect given the times. Go after a leader of the Union who helped save the Union by erasing any remnant of the history of the cause of manumission, and to do so by, if I may, fighting fire with fire. I mean, if federal courthouses that hear federal civil rights violations are to be targeted because they represent America, why not federal parks? And if going after U.S. Grant, why would General Sherman be exempt, especially given all the anti-Semitism rife throughout America's left today, and knowing that General Sherman was known as the second Moses by the slaves he liberated. I had to summon my inner Mark Stein for the above sentences. I hope you'll forgive me. But we are on a hunt now, aren't we? Discovering and uncovering badges and vestiges of racism we never knew existed, and never gave us a twinge, much less even a hint of thought until just this year. That's how bad the legacy of racism and our institutional racism is. We didn't even know about it, see it, act on it, or think about it. In other words, it was a nullity in every aspect of our lives until we were told, no, it's not. It's there. You just don't know it and you can't see it. But as a child, I was taught not to believe in ghosts, especially if there's no haunting. This is much like Dennis Prager's point that if we are such a racist society, why are the biggest news stories about racial incidents hoaxes or mistakes? Why does the racism need to be invented? Think Covington Catholic boys, think Jussie Smollett, think Bubba Wallace, think of the Oakland Lake Merritt incident. Just Google race hoaxes incidents. You'd be amazed how much there is. Again, the point. We seem hell-bent right now on proving how racist we are as a society when we aren't. To the point of digging up bones we didn't even know were in our burial sites because we didn't even know there were burial sites. Think John Muir. Or we invent them through mistake and hoax. What is of some interest to me is the issue of nexus, which is why I do not put Margaret Sanger in the same category of, say, John Muir. Sanger has been known forever as a eugenicist, and there is a clear causal connection between her views and her organization's practice. It's just that her organization's lobby didn't want to admit it. That is not the case of a ghost, but a true and real ghoul or vampire that has stalked society for far too long. Which brings us to Hadley Arkas's great line about rituals of empty exactitude and our language. There are now in our newsrooms and style manuals, as well as in our universities, new guidelines and instructions on the use of language. Not the language of epithets or terms derogatory. We ended all that a long time ago. But the use of language itself. And of course, what gets capitalized and what does not. Jeff Jacoby writes, the chair of the English department at Rutgers University, Rebecca Walkowitz, recently sent a 3,400-word email on the subject to staff, students, and faculty members. Her message went into considerable detail to describe the ongoing and future initiatives that are planned to create and promote an anti-racist environment, to eradicate, quote, the violence and systemic inequities facing Black, Indigenous, and people of color members of our community, and to cultivate critical conversations on state power, racism, violence, white supremacy, protest, resistance, and justice, close quote. I should first pause to note who knew Rutgers was such an antebellum hotspot of racial hostility. Why would anyone have gone there, much less worked in such an environment of violent and systemic racism and white supremacy? But now that we know Rutgers to be a violent outpost of white supremacy, what is the solution? What is to be done? Not end its federal aid, to be sure. That would be my first thought, as federal aid is conditioned to every school on compliance with standards of civil rights. So, no, evidently not that, though the school is violently racist. So the answer? Back to Jacoby quoting Chair Walkowitz, quote, "Our approach challenges the familiar dogma that writing instruction should limit emphasis on grammar and sentence-level issues so as not to put students from multilingual, non-standard academic English backgrounds at a disadvantage," close quote. Or as law professor David Bernstein puts it all more clearly, the Rutgers English department wants to make sure that students who come to Rutgers with a poor grasp of standard written English not only remain in that state, but come to believe that learning standard English is a concession to racism. I remember when keeping people of color ignorant was considered part of white supremacy. I think what the African-American speech pathologist Leonidas Johnson wrote is even more appropriate. He wrote, quote, "The idea that expecting a student to write in grammatically correct sentences is indicative of racial bias is asinine. It's like these people believe that being non-white is an inherent handicap or learning disability. That's racism. It has become very clear to me that those who claim to be anti-racist are often the most racist people in the country," close quote. So knowing, per the New York Times, that white parents are the biggest problem in elementary and secondary education, and knowing that the English language is itself a vestige of racial violence, the AP News recently announced, per Fox, quote, "It would capitalize the word black when used to describe racial, ethnic, or cultural topics, but decided that white will not receive the same treatment, particularly because the news gathering service feels capitalizing white could subtly legitimize white supremacy beliefs." As the editor-at-large for Standards of the AP wrote, quote, "The AP style will continue to lowercase the term white in racial, ethnic, and cultural senses, as white people generally do not share the same history and culture or the experience of being discriminated against because of skin color. In addition, we as a global news organization and in much of the world understand there is considerable disagreement, ambiguity, and confusion about whom the term white includes. But," as the editor continues, "people who are black have strong historical and cultural commonalities, even if they are from different parts of the world," close quote. Understand that? Black people think alike, historically and culturally at least, and white people do not. Please explain this to Candace Owens and Clarence Thomas so that Al Sharpton and Clarence Page will start agreeing with Owens and Thomas. But of course you know that is not the task. The task is to get everyone to think like Al Sharpton. I suppose I take umbrage in this categorization of being white and not sharing the same history and culture as other whites, the way evidently all black people do, for I thought I actually had a lot in common with some of my friends, of all colors, including white, which is why we are friends. But I know this is all actually crap, as I know I have much more in common with Larry Elder than I do with either Al Sharpton or Chuck Schumer, or for that matter, Nancy Pelosi, or for that matter, Jerry Nadler, as he has more in common with me than he does with, I don't know, Don Lemon, let's say. So you can see quite quickly, and evidently, beyond peradventure, we all of us, actually know all of this. The AP knows it just as Don Lemon knows it, just as you and I know it. So we shall now engage in this ritual of empty exactitude to play along in some kind of routine burlesque, in Arcus's words, a routine burlesque that becomes a quick parody of itself, immediately taking a serious issue, racism, and turning it into an unserious one. But I do have a nagging question. If one's white skin color makes one automatically, systematically engaged in racism and inequality, as the AP instructs us or believes, will they now fire all their white reporters and columnists? Shouldn't they? Another question. There's a Marxist writer named Bell Hooks. She deliberately lowercases her name for reasons really only explainable to her, so far as I can tell. She's also an African-American woman. She is the scholar the Smithsonian uses in a video to explain the problem of whiteness to the rest of us. What if she, who lowercases her name, is described in the AP with her lowercase name, but identified in capitalizations the way she seems to not want? Much confusion, I should think, but maybe we're not supposed to think. Not to be outdone here, Nell Irvin Painter writes in the Washington Post this morning, quote, "White Americans have had the choice of being something vague, something unraced, and separate from race. A capitalized white challenges that freedom by unmasking whiteness as an American racial identity as historically important as blackness, which it certainly is," she writes. "No longer should white people be allowed the comfort of this racial invisibility. They should have to see themselves as raced. Being racialized makes white people squirm. So let's racialize them with that capital W." Close quote. So white people until today were unraced, and we must make them raced, cognizant of their race. I guess I'm sorry because I guess I'm now confused. But it's quite like being lost on the Muir Trail, I suppose. I never thought of my race as important or indicative of anything any more than I thought of anyone's race as indicative or important to anything either. You see, I learned years ago there were regimes that did think in terms of racial categorization, racial commonalities and differences, and they then placed those commonalities and differences into a hierarchy. That's what you do. I read and learned all about it from the trials at Nuremberg in 1946 and worked backward to see how it could possibly come about, as did Robert Jackson in his closing argument in Nuremberg. That's exactly what happens to a society that starts by declaring all humans to be in the same category, then backtracks on that, then fights a war to redeclare the original proposition, then finds vestiges of the country that cannot accept the ending of the war, then commits itself to further concretizing the ending of that war and recommitting in federal law based on constitutional amendment that fundamental and natural truth, only to then find reason to upend once again that truth to recategorize us yet again. Robert Jackson closed his argument in Nuremberg with these words, quote, "If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say there has been no war, there are no slain, and there has been no crime," close quote. But you see, for most of us with a modicum of education about the human condition and American history, we know who the guilty are. We know there were wars about all of this. We know who was slain and why, and we know what the crimes were. And it all began with the notion that race must be made a conscious and conscientious thing. The only point, is so that race becomes, in the words of the Washington Post and the AP, a distinguishing and conscientious factor in our daily social and professional lives. So that race and racialized thinking, can matter. And once it matters, so that it can be qualified, not just quantified, given a quality, for that's what it means to matter, after all, to make a difference, to give something substance. I truly do fear. I fear all this. For it may start with language and words, and rituals to parody, initially, rituals of seeming empty exactitude, seeming. But behind those rituals, something moves deep and ominous. It may start with language and words, but language and words matter, as almost all things do, and they can be used for liberty and liberation, just as they can be used for enslavement and tyranny. Using words and language this way will not end well. History shows us it hardly ever does. I'm Seth Leibson. Lines are open.